January 1943. The western bank of the Volga River, somewhere beneath the snow-covered ruins of Stalingrad. A young Red Army soldier, Ivan, a former history student from Leningrad, sat on an ammunition crate, rubbing his numb fingers. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, the icy wind, and the distant yet relentless stench of death. His company had just repelled a series of attacks, and now, in a rare moment of calm, only an exhausting silence prevailed, broken by the crackle of a radio. His daily ration consisted of bread, black as earth, a small portion of groats, and, if lucky, fish cans the locals called the stinker. He pulled from his pocket a lump of sugar wrapped in a dirty piece of paper, today's allotment. Suddenly, a frozen messenger burst into the dugout, his face wrapped in scarves, expressing excited confusion. "Comrade Lieutenant," he exhaled, addressing the aged company commander, Petrenko. "They've brought a truck from the rear. They say it's American. They're unloading crates." Petrenko, a man with 1,000 furrows on his face, grumbled gloomily. "What kind of nonsense is this now? Did they bring bombs for the Katyushas?" "No, Comrade Lieutenant. Food, it seems." This news rippled through the dugout in a whisper. Food? Ivan stood up, his body, accustomed to fatigue, tensing with curiosity. They climbed out of the shelter, into the blinding white day. Near the shattered road stood an American Studebaker truck, its green body sharply contrasting with the grim winter landscape. Two soldiers were already prying open a wooden crate with axes. Ivan expected to see cartridges or grenades. Instead, when the top lid cracked and flew off, the eyes of all present fixed on the silvery cans, tightly packed in wood shavings. "What is this?" someone whispered. One of the soldiers pulled out a can, turning it in his hands with bewilderment. On it were incomprehensible English letters, Tushanka. Ivan, who knew a little of the language, muttered, "Tushanka, meat, canned." Lieutenant Petrenko, a skeptic to his core, snatched the can from him, examining it from all sides. "What kind of meat?" he grumbled. With a sharp movement, he opened the can with his knife. Everything froze. In the crate lay even stranger things. Small boxes labeled Kellogg's, packets of a yellow powder nobody could identify, and, most strangely, small brown bars in bright wrappers. Ivan took one of them. The wrapper depicted a soldier in a helmet that resembled neither the Soviet nor the German kind, and the writing said, "Hershey's." He carefully unwrapped it. A strong, unmistakable aroma of cocoa hit his nostrils. It was chocolate, but not the hard, bitter bar sometimes given in hospitals, but something soft, sweet, almost immoderately rich. He carefully bit off a piece. The sweetness spread through his mouth, feeling like an almost indecent luxury in this realm of hunger and death. He couldn't believe his taste buds. Around him, a quiet, bustling activity began. Someone tried the powder, prepared with water from melted snow. It turned out to be egg powder, something like an omelet. Someone was chewing on dry breakfast made from cornflakes. On everyone's faces was the same expression. Not so much joy, but sincere, profound, genuine shock. Shock from the quality, from the variety, from the very fact such food existed. It was as if a creature from another planet had landed among them, offering unfathomable gifts. Lieutenant Petrenko, still holding the half-empty can of Tushanka, silently watched his soldiers, and even in his hardened eyes, one could read something beyond the usual severity, something like a crucial realization. Lieutenant Petrenko was silent for too long. His gaze wandered from face to face of his soldiers, who were examining the American rations with childlike astonishment. The oldest sergeant, Uncle Makola, a veteran of the Finnish War, carefully placed a small can of coffee on the table as if it were a sacred artifact. "That's a whole fortune," whispered one of the younger men. "Distribute it in equal shares," Petrenko suddenly shouted roughly, returning to his role as commander. But even his voice lacked its usual steel. "And don't eat it all now. This is for several days." But nobody was listening to the order anymore. The men were already sharing the chocolate, crunching on the hard but incredibly sweet cookies called military biscuits. Ivan, still holding half a Hershey's bar in his hand, couldn't look away. He remembered his father's stories about the famine of the 20s. He knew the taste of acorn bread. And this sweetness, this undeniable abundance, it wasn't just nourishing the body. It was striking at the very foundation of everything they had been told. During political lessons, orators spoke condescendingly about the festering crisis in the camps of imperialism, about the hungry unemployed in Chicago, about exploitation. But these canned goods, this chocolate, this white powder that turned into an egg omelet, these were not the products of a crisis. These were the products of a country that produced so much it could afford to feed foreign soldiers thousands of kilometers away. Stopa, his comrade, a former tractor driver, nudged him, proudly showing an open can of Tushanka. The pieces of pork in fat looked much better than the second-grade stuff they sometimes received. "What do you think?" he asked. "Do they eat like this every day over there in America?" The question hung in the cold air. Nobody answered, but everyone heard it. Ivan glanced at the Studebaker being unloaded further away. This truck, these canned goods, the planes flying all the way through Iran, this wasn't just aid. It was a demonstration of strength, of power, which they couldn't even have dreamed of. Suddenly, Uncle Mykola, grim and practical, approached the crate of canned food. He took one can, ran his rough fingers over its smooth surface, over the perfectly sealed seam. "Look, lads," his voice sounded louder than usual. "This tin, thin but strong. An even seam, no burrs. To make something like this on a conveyor belt by the thousands? We only have things like this for shells, for the most important things, for ammunition. And they ship meat around the world in packaging like this. This isn't like our stinker in sheet iron." This simple observation hit with a new force. It wasn't about taste. It was about technology. About something they, the Soviet soldiers, had only seen from one side, in the form of German Tigers and Panthers, whose guns pierced their T-34s straight through. But now, this technological might stood before them in another form, in the form of a can of meat. It was the same level of industrial development, the same production power, but directed not at destruction, but at preserving life, their life. Ivan lowered his gaze to his Mosin rifle, reliable but archaic, a model from Tsarist times. He remembered the German MG-42s that planed down a board at hundreds of meters, and now this tin can. It was just as much a symbol of industrial might as a tank or a machine gun. But if German power was directed against them, the American one was for aid. This thought brought not only relief, but also a strange feeling of humiliation. They, soldiers of the mighty Red Army that had stopped the Wehrmacht at Moscow, were now being fed from the hand of unseen allies. Lieutenant Petrenko, coming closer, as if reading his thoughts, looked out at the frozen, shell-scarred field beyond the dugout. "Now it's clear why they're in no hurry with the Second Front," he muttered gloomily. "They fight with factories, and we fight with blood." There was a bitter truth in these words. The American tushonka, chocolate, egg powder, all of it wasn't just aid. It was a currency with which the USA paid for Soviet lives. For every day the Red Army wrested from the Wehrmacht at the cost of incredible losses. Ivan felt the sweet bar in his pocket suddenly gain an unbearable weight. It was a payment. Payment for the fact that he and his comrades were the cannon fodder in this global game. He no longer saw a miracle in it, only a harsh economic calculation wrapped in a bright wrapper. The unsettling sweetness melted on Ivan's tongue, leaving only a memory. But the evening of that day was different. Instead of the usual gloomy silence over a pot of sloshing slop soup, the dugout was buzzing. The soldiers, sitting on bunks, ammunition crates, or simply on straw bedding, were sharing their impressions. Uncle Mikola, heating tushonka on a piece of sheep metal, were sharing with an expert's air. "Lots of fat, energy. This isn't like that stinker. This is meat, real meat." Styopa, carefully mixing egg powder with water, was making himself a snail, a small portion of omelet on the heated surface of the potbelly stove. "Look how it froths, just like real eggs," he marveled, and the fire in his eyes came not only from the flames, but from this small culinary miracle. Even Lieutenant Petrenko, having separated himself in a corner, was stubbornly eating his portion of tushonka with hardtack instead of the usual bread. He said nothing, but his posture, relaxed, unmilitary, spoke for itself. This wasn't just food. It was an act of psychological rearmament. Ivan sat apart, unwrapping another chocolate bar. He wasn't rushing. He examined the wrapper, bright, sturdy, with clear print. He wasn't thinking about the taste, but about the person who had made it. Somewhere far away, across the ocean, in some factory, some American worker, perhaps a woman, had been packing these bars. She didn't know Ivan or Stalingrad or the horror that reigned here. But her labor, the labor of thousands of workers like her, was now here, in his hand. It was the most powerful argument against the propaganda posters depicting the West as a kingdom of hunger and profiteering. No political officer's lecture could argue with the silent language of this chocolate bar, of this can of meat. They were tangible proof of a might that was not hostile, but allied. This realization brought not only relief, but also a deep, subconscious dissonance. If everything they had been told about capitalism was a lie in this instance, then what else was? Suddenly, the world had become much more complex than the black and white pictures painted by propaganda. Ivan bit off a piece, and this time the sweetness seemed bitter with this realization. Suddenly, Styopa, curious, picked up a box of Kellogg's dry breakfast. He opened it carefully, as if diffusing a mine. Inside lay golden cornflakes, light, airy, like feathers. "And this is bread?" he whispered in surprise. The guys gathered around, examining the strange food. One of the soldiers, the youngest, named Timofey, carefully put one flake in his mouth. His face lit up with a surprised smile. "Sweet!" he exclaimed, "and it crunches." This simple discovery caused a wave of laughter, sincere, childlike, the kind that hadn't been heard in the dugout for a long time. They passed the box around in a circle, each trying a small piece of this wonder. Even Petrenko couldn't resist and took a few flakes. He chewed, nodded thoughtfully. Convenient, doesn't spoil, weighs little, cleverly designed. This scene struck Ivan more deeply than the chocolate or the tushonka. This wasn't just food. It was the imprint of an entire way of life. A way where food could be not just calories for survival, but also a source of joy, lightness, unexpected taste. He recalled pre-war life in Leningrad, the bread lines, the constant shortages, the same products day in and day out. And here before them was variety, salty meat, sweet chocolate, crunchy flakes, coffee. Each product had a different taste, a different texture, a different purpose. It was the antithesis of Soviet utilitarianism, where everything was subordinated to survival. This food spoke the language of freedom of choice, the language of abundance they could only dream of. And this language was overwhelmingly convincing. Uncle Mykola, watching the guys share the flakes, smiled bitterly. "So much for the festering capitalism," he said quietly to Ivan. "Festering, you see, with chocolate and meat. And we, the flourishing socialism, with the stinker and slop. Now that's irony." These words hung in the air like the blast wave from a shell. No one answered, but everyone heard. Everyone understood. That evening in the dugout, they didn't just eat American rations. That evening in the dugout, they consumed an entire ideology. And after that, food would never be the same again. The bitter-sweet taste of revelation lingered with Ivan, but his reflections were interrupted by Sergeant Mykola. He walked over to the potbelly stove where Styopa was enthusiastically stirring his egg powder and nodded at the empty tushonka can. "You see, lads?" His voice was hoarse but distinct. "This tin, thin but strong, even seam. To make something like this on a conveyor belt by the thousands. We only have things like this for shells, for the most important things. And they ship meat around the world in packaging like this." This simple observation struck with renewed force. It wasn't just about the taste of the food, but physical proof of a technology they were deprived of. Ivan glanced at his Mosin rifle, reliable but archaic, a model from Tsarist times. He recalled the German MG-42s that planed down aboard at hundreds of meters, their tigers, against which their own guns were powerless. And now this tin can. It was just as much a symbol of industrial might as a tank. But if German power was directed against them, the American one was for aid. This thought brought not only relief, but also a strange feeling of humiliation. They, soldiers of the mighty Red Army that had stopped the Wehrmacht at Moscow, were now being fed from the hand of unseen allies. Lieutenant Petrenko, coming closer as if reading his thoughts, looked out at the frozen, shale-scarred field beyond the dugout. "Now it's clear why they're in no hurry with the second front," he muttered gloomily. "They fight with factories, and we fight with blood." There was a bitter truth in these words. The American tushonka, chocolate, egg powder, all of it wasn't just aid. It was a currency with which the USA paid for Soviet lives. For every day the Red Army wrested from the Wehrmacht at the cost of incredible losses. Ivan felt the sweet bar in his pocket suddenly gain an unbearable weight. It was a payment payment for the fact that he and his comrades were the cannon fodder in this global game. He no longer saw a miracle in it, only a harsh economic calculation wrapped in a bright wrapper. Meanwhile, Stipa, curious, began examining the packaging itself. He found writing on the crate, U.S. Army Field Ration, not to be sold. And further, in small print, a list of contents. "Look," he said to Ivan, "it even says how much protein, fats, everything is calculated. Even in war, everything is done scientifically with them." This detail stunned Ivan. The Soviet ration was simply food, whatever they managed to procure. The American ration, however, was a calculated amount of calories, balanced nutrition, a scientific approach to feeding a soldier. It was the approach of a civilization that could afford to think not only about survival, but about optimal efficiency. Even in this, the same industrial logic was evident as in the perfect can. Everything standardized, everything calculated, everything subordinated to a single system. Even the process of distributing the rations happened according to new rules. Instead of just throwing each man a piece of bread and a spoonful of porridge, the soldiers now received an individual set: a can of tushonka, several hardtacks, a piece of chocolate, a portion of coffee. It was a small but noticeable act of individuation within the collective, something completely uncharacteristic of the Soviet system. Each soldier could decide for himself when and what to eat, how to manage his portion. This crumb of freedom in decision-making, in a world where all decisions were made for them, was as unusual as the taste of chocolate. Uncle Mykola, observing this, remarked grimly, "They're not just bringing us food, they're bringing us their customs. That's what's frightening." He was right. Along with the canned goods and chocolate, a value system was also crossing the ocean, one that was gradually undermining the foundation of Soviet ideology. A system where individual efficiency, a scientific approach, and freedom of choice, even in such minor matters as a food ration, were natural phenomena. Ivan understood that after the soldiers grew accustomed to this new reality, returning to the old ways of thinking would be impossible. They had already tasted the forbidden fruit, and this fruit had turned out to be not only delicious, but also eye-opening to a world that was far more complex and multifaceted than the one depicted by the political officers. The heavy thoughts vanished when the familiar, piercing whistle came from the night sky. "Air raid! Get down!" roared Lieutenant Petrenko. The dugout froze for a moment, then exploded into chaos. The light went out, and in the next second, the earth convulsed with a deep spasm. A dull thud, the crack of wood, a pouring rain of earth from the ceiling. The air filled with suffocating dust and the smell of explosives. Ivan instinctively pressed himself to the ground, covering his head with his hands, clutching that same chocolate bar in his palm. The taste of gunpowder and fear returned to his mouth, the real, familiar taste of war. The shelling didn't last long, but its consequences were brutal. When everything fell silent, they crawled out from behind the debris. One of the Studebakers was burning, illuminating the scattered crates of American rations with a grim flame. The soldiers, forgetting their shock and reflections, rushed to salvage the cargo. They were soldiers, and their instinct said, "Food is life." Ivan, along with the others, carried untouched crates to shelter. His fingers gripped the wooden edges, and he saw Styopa, burning his hands, pulling cans of tushonka from under the damaged truck bed. Lieutenant Petrenko coordinated the efforts, his voice once again steely, devoid of doubt. The fire, death, and destruction had returned them to the harsh reality, where there was no place for philosophizing. American aid had once again become simply a resource, a single piece of luck in the hellish landscape. When the danger had passed, Ivan, sitting on an ammunition crate, unwrapped the last piece of Hershey's. It had softened slightly from the warmth of his body. He put it in his mouth and closed his eyes. It was no longer the taste of shock or bitter realization. It was the taste of energy. The taste of what would allow him to hold his weapon tomorrow, to go on the attack, to survive. He looked at his comrades, who were now silently dividing the salvaged rations with a new, grim determination. The propaganda illusions had dissipated like smoke after the shelling. What remained was a simple, cruel truth. This food gave them the strength to fight. And it didn't matter which system it came from, capitalist or socialist. The only thing that mattered was that it helped them win. The sweetness was gone, but its trace remained. Not shock, but acceptance. Acceptance of this complex, imperfect, yet vitally necessary aid in their shared struggle. The next morning, the company received orders to advance. Before the march, Lieutenant Petrenko distributed the remaining American rations. There was no childlike wonder now. The soldiers divided the food with the concentration of athletes before a competition. Everyone understood. These calories could be decisive out there, ahead in the hell of street fighting. Ivan stuffed the hardtack and a piece of chocolate into his pocket. He was no longer thinking about politics or ideology. He was thinking about how this food would give him the strength to cover another few hundred meters now, to dash from basement to basement under machine gun fire. As they moved out, Ivan noticed a change in his comrades' behavior. They walked differently than before. A new springiness appeared in their movements, in their eyes, not just the usual desperation, but also a bright fire of energy. During breaks, they didn't collapse from exhaustion, but took out their rations, eating slowly, savoring every morsel. This food didn't just nourish them, it restored their sense of control over their own bodies, over their own endurance. In the battle for the next building, Ivan felt it himself. After an hour of heavy assault, when they finally secured the new position, his hands weren't trembling from fatigue. His mind remained clear. He remembered the chocolate eaten before the attack and understood. This was the true value of this aid. Not in ideological reflections, but in this simple physical ability to fight better, longer, more effectively. That evening, as the soldiers gathered in the basement of the captured house, Sergeant McCullough said unexpectedly, "Still, we should thank those Americans. Whatever the case, it's easier to fight with their Tushonka." There was no surprise or bitterness left in his words, just a statement of fact. It was a turning point. American aid had ceased to be a novelty and became part of their military reality. That night, Ivan was writing a letter home. He couldn't write about the battles, the fear, the death. Instead, he wrote about how they had received the American food. "Imagine, Mother," he wrote, "we are eating real meat here. Chocolate, egg powder. It's as if I've stepped into a fairy tale." There was not only joy in these words, there was hope. Hope that somewhere another life existed, a life without hunger and the constant struggle for survival. As he was finishing the letter, Stipa sat down beside him. "You know," he said quietly, "I was thinking today, when the war ends, maybe someday we'll live like that too. We'll eat chocolate whenever we want, not just on holidays." There was no envy in his words, just a quiet, timid dream. A dream born from an American chocolate bar amidst the ruins of Stalingrad. The next week, they received another shipment of American rations. Already, without surprise, without lengthy discussions, the soldiers simply distributed them among themselves. This food had become as familiar to them as the Mosin rifle or a helmet. But Ivan noticed one detail. When one of the newly arrived soldiers saw the American rations for the first time, the same expression of shock and disbelief appeared on his face that they once had. And the old soldiers would explain to the new ones with a smile that this was American Tushanka, and that it was much better than our stinker. Thus, American aid became not only material support, but also a symbol of a new reality that was gradually permeating the consciousness of the Soviet soldiers. It carried within it not only calories, but also new ideas, new perceptions of the world, new dreams. And these ideas turned out to be far more powerful than any propaganda. When, a few months later, Ivan was wounded and ended up in a hospital, he encountered American aid again. But now it wasn't just rations. It was medicines, equipment, even drugs. He lay on an American mattress, under an American blanket, and examined medicine packaging with English writing. The world had become even bigger, even more complex, but no longer as frightening. After the war, Ivan returned home. He brought back not only medals, but also the memory of the taste of American chocolate. And when the famine began in 1947, it was this memory that helped him understand the full depth of the tragedy unfolding around him. He looked at the empty shelves in the shops, at the exhausted people, and remembered those crates of American rations amidst the ruins of Stalingrad. And these memories were worse than any wound. Many years later, when Ivan told his grandchildren about the war, he always remembered not only the battles, but also the American rations. It was like a miracle, he would say, as if someone had stretched out a helping hand to us from another world. And there was no longer any bitterness or doubt in his words, only sincere gratitude for that piece of chocolate that had given him the strength to survive one more day of war. And so the taste of American chocolate stayed with him for the rest of his life, not as a symbol of political games or ideological contradictions, but as a reminder of simple human solidarity in the most terrible of times. And in that taste lay the whole complex truth about the war, a truth that could not be found in official reports or propaganda leaflets.